Great, that looks good. Do you have any?
Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Chris Roche from the Institute of Human Security at the Trobe University. Conference Zoom account, can you turn off your... Thank you. Welcome to the panel. I'd first like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation whose unceded land the Trobe University sits upon, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. We got a chockers panel, so we're going to move as fast as we can. I'd just like to introduce researchers from Indonesia, the Solomons and Papua New Guinea, although we're having a little bit of a trouble with the Papua New Guinea connection from Daru. So the panel brings together researchers who are part of the Developmental Leadership Program, an international research initiative looking at the role of leadership in the promotion of developmental change. And we got a great panel, which I'll introduce. They will then speak for 5 or 7 minutes each, and then we'll get engaged in the discussion. So I'd like to introduce first the team working on an interesting research program on disability leadership in Indonesia. Cucu Saidah, an activist and development practitioner with over 20 years experience, who has established the Bandung Independent Living Center, and she also founded the Jakarta Barrier-Free Tourism initiative to increase the awareness of rights of people with disability in public spaces. With her colleagues is Ishak Salim, a researcher and activist with a strong interest in leadership and capacity development in India's disability rights movement. And in 2016, he co-founded the Indonesian Disability for Equality movement. And which we may be joined by Elizabeth Jackson, who has worked at La Trobe at the Institute of Human Security, a lot of 10 years of Indonesia experience, most recently with the Knowledge Sector Initiative. So they'll speak first. They'll be followed by Toni and maybe Gordon Nanau. Toni is from the province of Malaita in the Solomon Islands, a PhD candidate at the University of South Pacific. And his doctoral thesis is on constituency development funds in the Solomon Islands and its implications for governance, service delivery and development. And Gordon, if he joins us, is a senior lecturer in politics of the international affairs at the School of Government at the University of South Pacific. And last but not least, a team who's been doing research on leadership beyond state limits in Papua New Guinea, Baia Warapa, who works for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Daru, southwestern Fly, and has previous experience working with World Vision and Maori Stokes, but also with Aboriginal communities and in the city of Perth for many years. And finally, Mark Moran, a development specialist, author and researcher, with long experience with World Vision and as an academic at the University of Queensland. Also author of a very interesting book, Serious Whitefella Stuff, which I can recommend. So we're going to start off with Cucu, who's going to talk a little bit about the work they're doing in Indonesia and the disability leadership movement. Cucu, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Yeah, in Indonesia, I would like to talk about regarding the leadership. There are since years ago that in Indonesia disability movement has been really quite active, and then especially after the 2006 when the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is signed by the UN, and then Indonesia in disability movement, the organizations of persons with disabilities are become really actively push hard to endorse the government of Indonesia to ratify the convention. So in terms of the convention, in terms of the leadership itself, there are different types of the leadership previously or even still existing. That's I can call something like the conventional, where the organizations of persons with disabilities are having like a kind of the umbrella organization, which that consists of the members of different organizations of persons with disabilities, which that's usually like impairment based or type of disability based. But then, as I said, since recent like 10 or 12 years recent, that's the movement or the leadership are growing. It's not only based or the organization that's members of that umbrella organization. There are now lots of organization of people with disability with disabilities that lead by people with disabilities, and then even like more and more growing up that organization of people with disabilities are now being known and then quite really actively engaged in different things. And the other things in terms of the leadership, I think the one that I just mentioned, it was like amongst the disability movement. The other things about the leaders of people with disabilities are they are those who are working in the mainstream organizations or institutions. That's it's not necessarily working within the disability movement, but they are working in the such kind of like private sectors, things like that. So in Indonesia, the leadership itself on people with disabilities, that they're quite well known. So not only in the local, but in the national, but also in the regional or even in the global level. So I think I'll stop here just for the introduction. I'll hand over to Chris again. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ishak, was Ishak going to also briefly talk? Ishak, if you talk to your experience and you introduce yourself as well, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. My name is Ishak Salim. I come from Makassar. It's quite far from Jakarta as the capital city of Indonesia. Continuing to Cucu explanation about the leadership of disability, in outside of Jakarta, in many areas, both in the western and eastern part of Indonesia, disabled people organizations or NGOs that concerned with disability issue have been established. The growth of this concern is a consequence of the development of new ideas or knowledge of resistance to ableism that moves people to make a social change. Since the late 90s, when critical approach such as Gramscian and Foucauldian began to be used as a tool for analyzing social phenomena in social movement by social activists, disabled people activists also use them to the labelizations, the stereotypifications, the segregation, and even the discriminations in their daily resistance. In the 2000s, many disability organizations in outside Jakarta were established and received support from many parties, especially from social movement organizations and also international development partners organizations that support the work of organizing and empowering people with disability in many areas. So today, in the struggle of Indonesian people towards an inclusive system, I think that currently we are being led by disabled people leaders. The leaders with different abilities are powerful and visionary in pursuing the stigmatization efforts, introducing new paradigms in dealing with disabilities. So the influence of disabled people leaders is not only inviting, for example, young people to make change in different ways, but also moving academics to participate in this change. The way they do research or the way they analyze social phenomena, also civil servants in the ministry, for example, relating to the how they provide regulation and programs to fill the disabled people rights, and even teachers in the school about how they should change the way they teach people's pupils, especially with disabilities, and many others, the whole levels and rooms for participation. So I think currently there are many followers working with disabled leaders in Indonesia, including myself. My experiences being a part of disability movements during a decade feel that disabled people leaders have strong commitment to accommodate the will to participate from the other disabled people and its supporters. So we have many kind of collective and collaborative actions, not only in changing policy and regulation, but also producing better knowledge in even to deconstructing what we call it the hegemony of biomedic knowledge in disability issues. And also from following this movement, I have many friends in the disability movement who are leaders in their area, local leaders from regencies or small cities in the Sumatra, Kalimantan, Maluku, West and East Nusa Tenggara, Bali, and even in Papua. And of course, many also local leaders in Java, not only in Jakarta. They organize disabled community and advocate for changing policies and regulation that have been disabled people. And today, these local leaders connect and coordinate easily as well as move together. And I think this is the context that I can present when talking about disability leadership. So when there is a situation where consolidation of disability leadership is needed, it's easy to happen, especially like in the pandemic situation like today.
Thank you, Ishak. And we'll come back to the pandemic because I know you've done some fascinating work in that regard. So thank you, Ishak. Let's go to Toni in Honiara. I hope you're near the telecom towers, so your connection is good.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. So can I go now?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'll be briefly discussing the Citizen State Relations project that we are currently doing in the Solomon Islands. And very, very briefly, we went into the communities and there are still some constituencies that left to do. But we went into the communities and then in the constituencies and identified particular projects of interest, especially ones that, you know, are outcomes of community efforts and those within these tribal groups and church leaders and all these institutions, they come together to, you know, plan and produce these collective goods, we should say. So we did North Malaita, in the northern part of Malaita, the Baia constituency, and we started 2 projects there. One we study is the Ramai Community King Stable House. It's a multi-purpose kind of hall, but mainly used for catering and preparing food during big events. And I must stress from the outset that most of the community members within Ramai are strong adherents to the teachings of Reverend Michael Miley O, who was excommunicated by the Southeast Evangelical Church way back in 2011. That's very important because the teachings and the church movement had a lot to do with these kind of projects taking place within the communities that are members of the what is commonly known locally as the movement. And this is mainly attached to the teachings of Reverend Michael. So for the Ramai King Stable House, it's a community effort. Mostly leaders within the community organize themselves and then arrange for fundraisings and all this that they need. And then they started building the project in 2016. Now, connecting it to the movement or the teachings of Reverend Maliau, the teachings urge followers to make changes in what they call 7 spheres of society. So one of them is health and healthy living. So they try to promote change within these areas. And that, shows out in the kind of projects that communities are coming up with. And one of them is the Ramai King Tables House, which is used for catering food during big events. Now, for this particular project, the idea behind was that the church should move away from traditional ways of feasting, where food spread on leaves in open spaces. And so the church is advocating more for better facilities to allow for food preparation and serving of food during big events. So the transformation and the push for change in this area is particularly coming from the church, and in this case, the church movement, more commonly known as the movement, which adheres to Reverend Michael's teaching. Now, what is interesting in this particular case is that healthy living in this case is not demanded by the church for the sake of health, but healthy living is promoted as a reflection of one's spiritual standing and the convictions. So for adherents of the teachings, healthy living is synonymous with Christian belief and conviction. So the collective effort to transform communities is demanded by the church, especially in the areas of health, finance, and there are others that I cannot cover at the moment. So that's where we see the context of the particular project in Ramai community. I'll move quickly and then touch on a bit more of the Lau Bailelia feeder road. Now, this particular project is important and it's interesting in that it's not a national project, as you saw, where the government recommends roads and all this through the Ministry of Infrastructure. But the initiative was taken by tribal group leaders. This is an area more inland, up in the mountains, and they, for the past 4 decades, they have little access to clinics and other services available down on the coast. So that pushed them to work together to try and organize themselves and allow for, road development to move up into the place and give them access to the much needed services down on the coast and in the provincial headquarters. So most of the tribal leaders took on the initiative and they did the organization within the tribes. So it's a kind of a more horizontal approach to development and to seeing a new way of arranging for big projects like the road the feeder road projects to take place and to move on without much disturbance, as it's quite common with the state-initiated projects. We see that once the state moves in, a lot of demands coming in from the local people. But with tribal groups playing an equal part within the process and becoming equal partners within the process and the actual implementation of the project, we see little problem coming up from within the area or the region where the road is being built. And that makes the work move forward without difficulty and without much problem. One interesting thing, the tribal groups, they organized themselves, they made their own reconciliations within members, within families and extended families. And they tried as much as they could to avoid problems within spilling over into the work program and the overall project setting. So once there's a problem within, they solve it without the need of someone else from outside the tribe addressing it. So with that, things are easy to move forward. They do their own policing and security responsibilities. So if there's a problem within this, they solve the problem within the tribe without calling outside parties. And so with that and the responsibility as an equal partner within the process, the road project was able to move forward very easily. And actually the first phase was done, and they are planning to extend it to move forward into the western side of the constituency.
Thank you, Toni.
So
that's great. That's great. We'll come back to that, because I think what you've done is laid out very well. And I think for the people listening, it's worth noting that what Toni is exploring is locally led initiatives and how have they come about. And I think what you've demonstrated there is how the important role of the church in one case, and how that has led to interactions with local government and other forms of leadership. But in your second case, of how horizontal leadership is particularly important in driving change processes and security issues that are much more broader than just the road itself. So thank you, Toni. We'll come back to that. But now we've got Baia. Welcome, Baia. So pleased to see you and relieved to know you're on the call. Maybe Baia, as I've said, has been looking at informal and formal leadership in South Fly in PNG. And welcome, Baia. Maybe you could briefly talk to your project and experience.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Excellent.
Good one. Yeah, I'll be talking a little bit on the leadership beyond state limits, and basically our project area here is at South Fly in Western province of Papua New Guinea. And it's a project of research that's currently being done by myself and Mark. But we're talking about the village level leadership. And to start off with, Daru is the provincial capital here. And there is a very high urbanization in Daru where all the services in the district is kind of just centered here in Daru. And as a result, people come to the island it's not a very big island, but people come to the island to access services. And that also includes some government workers. And we have health posts that are left unattended in the villages, basically meaning that there is no government presence built in the local communities here in South Fly. And because of the service delivery is just centered from one place, just from the one hub here in Daru, we will also have our ward members traveling from the villages all the way to Daru to try to, look for opportunities or look for ways where they can bring back services to their village. And while doing that, they also get stuck on the island. They get stuck on the island, and it can come to a point where there is near total lack of public finances reaching the local levels in the villages over there. And because the ward members in these instances are coming to Daru and they get stuck here, the people back in the villages start to blame them if there is no service provided, if there is anything that happens in the village. So the ward members cope the blame for all those. But they may have a good intention to come to Daru, but then because the cost of doing things and it's just a one-way traffic thing and one-way traffic out, it impacts on their leadership, and the blame is on them by the people. But having said that, when the local ward members are coming to the island to try to get what they can for their people, there is a good sign that the informal leadership in the village level still exists. Like you have the ward development committees. These are the ones that the chair is the ward member, but in the absence of the ward member who comes to Daru in search of opportunities for his or her community, the ward development committee immediately takes on the as the governance in the village.
You still there, Baia?
Yeah, and you have the village courts, which are still in the villages and they're still operating. And for example, if the local schools there, primary schools, the school boards still operate in the villages, and you have women groups that operate in the villages, and of course churches. Churches are a very important part of the communities here, and so the presence of the church leadership in the villages is also very, very significant. We in this research, we are also finding out that there is a patronage system that's dominating the district here, where, for example, in the last election, Southlie at 54 candidates that contested for the elections, and because they contested for the elections, quite a large number contested for the elections. What happens is that the incumbent or the current member was only able to get 10% of the votes to win. Now, that creates a situation where when a current member is preparing for the next election, he or she will have to be very selective where the services will go to. So in this case, he or she will try to go into the constituents that have voted for him. And the delivery of services now through the member becomes one-sided, and because first of all, the member will have to please the voters so that come next election and be able to get voted again. And we have also a situation where external funders, for example, development workers, NGOs that come into the local communities, that they can be in a way displace the existing ward development committee. I've told you already that the ward development committee is the most powerful committee in any village here in Southlie, and it's a government recognized committee. But however, what happens is that when intervention is done by another organization, for example, World Vision goes into the community, and because World Vision now selects his or her own, the World Vision, sorry, not his or her own, but World Vision selects now their own committee to oversee the project in the community. For example, in the case of World Vision, they have what we call change agents in the communities. And because they have change agents, now the change agents committee become the most powerful committee over the existing ward development committee. So that kind of displacing the existing committee happens. I'll give you another example. I come from the Southland district as a ward, as a council area that's called the Treaty Villages. And the Treaty Inhabitants Council chairman is the chair to that the council. Okay, what happens now is that because the Australians deal direct, or the people deal direct when it comes to the dealing with the treaty villages, they'll deal direct through the treaty chairman. What happens is that it displaces the council president. So in this case, the treaty chairman becomes more powerful than the council president. So those are things that we are beginning to find out now, that outside committees can come in and they're able to displace the existing ones. Also,
Baia, I'm going to stop.
There's a powerful networking pact system that's happening in the district here. For example, if you are a ward member and you want to, bring your village together and want to vote for a candidate in the elections, you take a gamble. What happens is that you take a gamble, and when you take the gamble, you will have to make sure that let me put it this way, that when you take a gamble, you make sure that you move your support to the right person, because if your candidate loses, the current member may not be able to support you because you voted for the wrong person. So those are the kinds of politics that we play here, and it affects the local leadership.
Okay, Baia,
but there is
can I stop you there, Baia?
Existing informal.
Baia, I'm just going to stop you there. I'm stopping there, Baia, because I think Mark, are you in touch? I can't.
Yes, I'm WhatsApping him, but I don't know why he's not hearing you for some reason. That's strange. Yeah,
it's just that, to be fair to the panel, we do need to.
Yeah, but Baia, we've stopped you if you can hear us, mate.
So, because we'll come back to that, because I think what is fascinating about all of the presentations is the kind of recognition of the complexity of the local relationships between different institutions and how poorly understood those often are, and how they're interrupted by external affairs, external issues, funds of money, projects, etc. But I wanted to turn back to Cucu in particular, and Ishak, on the question of, obviously Indonesia is suffering badly from the impacts, secondary and direct, of COVID. But I think what you've been doing and exploring in terms of the leadership of the disability movement and what is going on in relation to COVID and disabled people in Indonesia, you've had some pretty interesting work that you're doing in that space that it would be really interesting to hear about. So I don't know if Cucu or Ishak is gonna. Are you still there? I think. Ishak, do you want to start?
Okay, I will start. In accordance with the context of the disability movement that I described earlier, when the pandemic occurs, we respond it immediately, especially when the government's response leaves people with disabilities behind. Because we are already connected and an online platform is increasingly being used by activists of the disability movements, consolidations can be done quickly. At that time, we did not think of getting full support from donors or the governments. we believe we have the ability to working together and do what we can. We also at that time agree we need data on how the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has on disabled people throughout Indonesia. We chose the online form because the increasing restrictions on people moving from the government. Then we succeed to manage and gather around 1,700 respondents, and we analyze data together. We analyze how the government communication media are accessible or not for disabled people. We also observe 3 impacts of the pandemic, such as personal and social impact, economic impact, and educational impact for disabled people. And in addition, we also want to know what kind of contribution of the disabled people during the pandemic, because we don't want to talk only the negative impact, but we believe that people with disabilities also have big contribution to respond to COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, we present our findings and recommendations to the central and even some local governments, which every local DPOs in our networks do important role to make it, to socialize or to present our findings. And also in our networks, DPOs networks in responding COVID, we do reflection, and hundreds disability activists do reflection, and we plan what we can do in the next step. And now we have done the second survey, and now we start to analyzing the findings, and we hope in the beginning of August we can present our findings relating to the pandemic. We have 2 important things that differentiate with the first survey is about vaccine, how disabled people access the information about vaccine and whether they want to do vaccine. The findings actually is worried us because many, around 40% disabled people don't want to go vaccine because of they don't know, or there are many hoax information they accepted. And the other information is relating to the mental health conditions, because now the pandemic makes some frustration to people, and especially disabled people. So we have information about whether they're angry or whether they're boring, etc. That's mine, Chris.
Thank you, Ishak. Cucu, are you there? So I think we may have lost Cucu. But I think Ishak is slightly underselling the kind of amazing work they've done, and the use of the way they've used WhatsApp to connect disabled people from throughout Indonesia. And Cucu was telling me, Ishak, that in part what that has done is broken down some of the divide between urban activists and activists in more remote parts of Indonesia. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Oh, Cucu's there.
Yeah, can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, still freeze. So thank you, Ishak has been explained. In my perspective, in my opinion, this pandemic, yes, it has really significant impact negatively. But on the other hand, that's there is a momentum. I think the pandemic was the momentum of that the disability movement now is even like unlimited, because now everyone do through the online. And then it was like the beginning last year in April through WhatsApp group amongst the activists, what are we going to do? And then we agreed to have that survey that Ishak has been explained. So in my point, I think what's the positive ways from that, the pandemic has been like leads or drive the movement about disability inclusion, not only within the disability community itself, but also has the impact to the more development and humanitarian aspect or humanitarian sectors. As we know, that's now there's lots of the humanitarian actors are aware of how really important to include or to really talk about disability inclusion in their response. So those, I think.
Oh. So we'll continue to be plagued. I think we've lost Cucu. But maybe turning to you, Toni, because I mean, clearly Solomon's, in terms of COVID, has not had many cases, but yet has the effects are still felt. And you certainly picked up, I think, some interesting findings from your work in that regard.
Yes, I think it depends wherever you are, but in the rural communities, mainly in the rural places, life goes on as usual, and people continue with their normal daily routine. But I think for the MPs who have been, failing a lot to produce something from the CDFs, the COVID kind of gives them the opportunity to explain reasons why they are not really coming up with things or are producing much during this period. So it has become an excuse to justify not doing something or not bringing something more tangible to the people. But that has been common over the years, especially with the use of CDFs. But now that the COVID situation somehow gives them the opportunity to try and justify their inability to produce something on that. But there are some local initiatives to try to address issues or challenge some of the challenges. One was, I've noticed that one, especially with the movement, they had they have a kind of system that was in place, part of the church structure for the movement. They call it the grocery. So it's a kind of a cashless kind of platform for exchanging local goods. So if you bring in, for instance, a bunch of banana worth $20, they'll value it using monetary value, like $20 worth. If someone else comes with a fish worth the same amount, you can come and exchange the fish for the banana. So that kind of initiative, was adapted to the current hardship and the challenges, probably in some parts of the constituencies that we studied. But for the rural people, I think they continue on with their normal and life. It's more to do with funds coming in through the Constituency Development Office. I mean, somehow slowed down. Probably it gives the MPs the chance to explain things more in the context of COVID.
Thank you, Toni. Super interesting to hear about the bartering arrangements, but also about how the political use of COVID to make political points and to use it as a scapegoat for inaction. I think we're seeing that in a few other places. And maybe then turning to the PNG team. I don't know if Baia, are you still there? Clearly,
I am.
Baia, PNG has been hit harder than the Solomons in terms of COVID. But also we're seeing recent interest, not least from Australia because of the proximity to the border, in terms of questions around Daru, and China obviously is starting to garner interest. So this part of the world is also gaining kind of political interest, and I'm wondering how that is playing out in terms of local leadership.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, go, Baia. We're hearing you well.
I'm not hearing it too loud, but given the COVID situation, basically for us here in the border to Australia and Indonesia, what happened was that the trades were closed. And as a result of that, people became a little bit resilient to the COVID situation, because they would normally go to Indonesia or to the Torres Straits to access services and for trade and all that. And because of the COVID situation, what has happened is that the people became resilient, and they went about trying to find out how they can support themselves during the COVID time. So they went into more commercial kind of fishing back in the villages, and many things came about. While it brought stopped them from doing things, stopped them from accessing services either in the Torres Strait or in Indonesia. But the good thing about the COVID was that it gave them some way of doing things. They had to look within themselves and say, okay, how can we support ourselves in this period? And that's what happened. They went into more commercial kind of fishing and bringing the produce to Daru, and the fishermen, the buyers were going from Daru to the villages, and they were able to support themselves and still are able to support themselves. So the COVID has brought in a new industry for the communities along the coast here. However, our COVID situation was that while in the country, the number went up to over 16,000, and Western Province was running second to NCD with the COVID infected figures, but the death was very, very minimal. And only during the time of when there was a high frequency of spread, it really affected the communities in doing the way they were doing things. There were travel restrictions and there were trade restrictions in many regards. But as time went on, like I said, people now started to look after themselves in these times of period.
Thank you, Baia. And Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, no, I guess the most obvious thing I would like to add is this amazing research collaboration that's developed between me and Baia. And now we've actually paused this research for a period of time because Baia is working with me on another project. So he's getting himself established as a local research assistant. And this has all been possible with the generous support of KTF, Kokoda Track Foundation, that have so there's a whole redesign and use of technology. And Baia has commented to me that his locally people are commenting that it's a good thing that that he's doing what he's doing in terms of bridging in the way that he is as a research assistant. So this is a fantastic thing that's come out of COVID. You did ask about the Chinese influence, the local. This is local research that we're doing, and the stuff that was in the media happened at a very high level, at a governor and Port Moresby level. So the local knowledge about that is very, very low. There is Chinese businesses that have been active in Daru for a long time, but there's been no increase in their activity. But better for what has happened and was happening anyway is that aid assistance into South Fly has really increased, and there's various reasons for that. But as Baia touched on, it is a lot tougher for people now because the border is closed. It's not only closed to people coming into Australia, to trade, which they used to under the traditional provisions of the treaty, but also the commercial fishery is also, so that's had a significant impact, and the Australian aid program is more active than it has been, and that is looking to increase. And the other bit of work that Baia is working on with me is front and center involved in working out how that aid assistance coming in can best be targeted. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And so if people have got questions, put them in the chat or in the Q&A. We have got a little bit of time for that. I can't see any at the moment. And Liz Jackson, who is meant to be on the panel, I think maybe I'm reading that you are in a participant. Is that right? And if so, do you want to put anything into the, I see. Have you got anything? Can we, and you're on, not on your own name. So Chris Adams, could we, is it possible to let Liz in, or Chris Adams is her name? I don't know, I'll leave that to the technicians.
That's been done, Chris, please go ahead.
Liz, are you here? Chris Adams, can you put your, Liz, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, never mind. Cucu, I think you wanted to add something on other impacts in Indonesia.
Yes, if you don't mind, I don't turn on my camera. If that's
all right,
okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, just one more thing I'd like to add into what's the momentum from this pandemic is that now the disability movement itself, and in terms of the leadership, it is now, it's like well connected, or like no burden, because previously, as in the previously the movement itself, or the it was like very segmented, or very fragmented, yeah, because it was like Jakarta based, who really have an access to the national governments or services, and then the local base was really really separated. I mean, the gap were there, but since the pandemic and everything, and everyone does through online, the connection, and then especially after what we did, the first survey, and continuity with the any different kind of Zooms or WhatsApp groups, things like that, it is now become blended, if I could say that's correct term. Yeah, between, so there is now like from the yes, there are still like organization or leaders based in Jakarta, or centralized central base, but now they are really blended with people from local means from the district and the province, and as well as the always like taking up into the next steps about the experience from the very local community. So I think that's one thing that I'd like to add into what the positive impact from this pandemic. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Over to you.
Thank you. And Liz, did you wanted to add something?
Only just in very broadly is to say that one of the things we want to be doing through this research is drawing on the experience of the research team. So those of you familiar with Indonesia will know that Cucu and Ishak and some of the other members of our team, Ekawati Liu, Johnny Yulianto, and others, are leaders themselves of the disability movement. So one of the things we'll be doing is drawing on their experience as leaders to understand what are the things that have supported them to become leaders, both kind of informal organisations as well as informally within communities. So yeah, it's a really exciting project, and very privileged to be working with such an experienced team of disability leaders in Indonesia. So look forward to our research findings in the next 6 months or so.
Thank you, Liz. And question for you, Toni. I don't know if you've seen it in the chat. Seen the question and answers?
Yeah, I've seen it. With regards to the movement in the northern part of Malaysia, and how they come up with projects and whether that is inclusive, they have a platform known more as the TRC. It's a church thing, and it's a session during which they raise these proposals and they float ideas during this particular. And what's interesting about this particular session is that it's attended by men, women, and youth. Anyone is invited. And during this particular prayer session and worship sessions, they usually allow for people to speak and say something they want to say. Especially this kind of projects and this kind of initiatives often many times come out through this particular session, and then people can debate it or discuss it. And once it's decided in there, anything that survives the TRC session goes out for implementation. And so women are, also included within these sessions. They can say what they want to say, but it's a time where ideas are floated, and discussions around these particular projects are encouraged, so that once things are decided within there, it survives the TRC session, then that goes out. It's like an agreement or a covenant kind of thing. So once it survives the TRC session, it goes on for implementation. So a lot of these big projects are often raised and discussed during this TRC session. For the case of the feeder road, I think consultations were done between families and extended family groups. So women, family members are also included within these discussions, and they also can voice out their opinion or whatever they want to say. So it's not really something that excludes women in this case, but the processes actually provide for women to continue to voice out whatever they want to say.
Thank you, Toni. And Baia, you wanted to come in? So did you want to come in, Baia? You had your hand up, I thought.
I think he's having trouble hearing. He might have the speaker of his phone turned down low. So.
Okay. Well, to be honest, I think we've actually got only a minute left. So, I mean, I'd just like to thank everybody. It's been a little bit chaotic. I apologize. I think what is clear is that the complexity of context has been brought out very clearly in terms of how collective leadership occurs, how different institutions interact. But COVID has opened up some interesting opportunities. And I think that what we're hearing from across the Pacific is questions about what happens if and when we go back to normal, and certainly how do we protect some of the gains that have been made, some of the spaces that have been opened up for leadership to emerge. And I think that's an ongoing challenge that needs to be taken seriously. But there's a fear that the aid industry in particular would just snap back to where it was before will start to occupy spaces in unhelpful ways and close down that leadership. So there's something, probably a responsibility on us all to try and keep those spaces emerging and protected. So thank you, everybody. Sorry for some of the technical challenges, but I hope the participants have enjoyed it. Maybe face-to-face next time somewhere, who knows? Thank you.